ahead and get started. Again, I want to thank everyone for coming to hear about this work and to engage in a conversation with us today about what the results that we saw and the injuries that Homer and his colleagues documented in Bangladesh. And so today, what we're going to talk a little bit about PHR's previous work in Myanmar and documenting what has happened to the Rohingya. We're going to talk a little bit about the camp conditions and what we saw in the refugee camps in Bangladesh, the injuries documented, and then next steps and actions that we can take. So as I alluded to, PHR has a long history of working in Myanmar and documenting the history of abuses that the Rohingya people have suffered. And this most recent issue has been an extraordinary wave of violence that has built on decades of abuse and discrimination of the Rohingya people in Myanmar. So we are today going to focus on this most recent wave of violence, which began at the end of August and drove hundreds of thousands of Rohingya across the border into Bangladesh, where they are now living in makeshift refugee camps. So again, just a little bit of backdrop. As I said, there's been a long history of abuse of the Rohingya, and this most recent wave of violence began at the end of August and was characterized by clearance operations by the security forces of Myanmar, in which villages were razed, lit on fire, many people were killed, and what we saw in the camps was evidence of beatings and gunshot wounds, and indications of mass sexual violence as well. According to the latest numbers, nearly 650,000 Rohingya have fled across the border into Bangladesh, and the government of Myanmar is conducting a campaign of misinformation, indicating that they're not exactly sure why people have left and that perhaps the Rohingya have burned down their own homes. And the documentation that Dr. Ventures and his team did in Bangladesh really refutes this narrative and indicates a significant level of violence carried out by the military, and that was our goal that was one of our goals in this research, was to refute the false narrative coming from the Myanmar government. So I wanted to turn to this map here that you see on your screen just to give a little bit of geographical context. At the top, you'll see Cox's Bazar, which is a local resort town in Bangladesh that is now characterized as many, if you've ever been to a region in a humanitarian crisis, that is now sort of the headquarters for many of the humanitarian organizations and aid workers. And then south of Cox's Bazar, you see this list of settlement camps. Kutupalong is the largest refugee camp, and had a relatively small population of Rohingya from a previous exodus that took place, and now has expanded from I think less than 100,000 people to around 400,000 people in a broadly expanded and makeshift camp. So there's a smaller formal camp and then a much larger makeshift camp. South of that, you see Balukali Camp, which is where we spent most of our time, and the photographs you'll see in a moment all come from Balukali Camp, and it's the second largest camp. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ventures to talk a little bit about the camp conditions and what he and his colleagues, you see Dr. Ventures here with our colleague Dr. Rohini Har, the two of them along with Dr. Parveen Parmar did the injury assessments and research we're going to talk about today.
Thanks, DeDe. So as you can tell from this photograph, the camps really stretch on for farther than the eye can see. So for anyone who's been in a refugee camp, this is not a surprise. For those who haven't, the horizon seems to just carry more and more of these shanties, of these huts, these living spaces, every time you reach a new vista or a new height, you can see the camps extending on further and further. So here, with the camp, which is not the largest of the camps, you can also get a sense of how close everything is. And so the conditions that we're concerned about, that not just us, but many in the WHO and other health-related relief organizations are concerned about, a lot of them have to do with the close proximity, with the incredibly high density of people here, so that even by refugee camp standards, these things are much closer. People have less personal space. Also, there is a very close proximity between people, basic sanitation like latrines, and then moving water. And so entry into the camps from the road is almost universally over some small stream or tributary, and there's a whole series of bridges, footbridges, the one you see in front of you being probably one of the larger, more robust of these. And then we can go to the, and then throughout these camps, there are small little waterways that right now in the dry season pose problems, certainly because of their proximity. You can see some structures there close to the edge that are a couple that are latrines. One on the left is a shower area, but very close quarters between the space that's used for bathing and play, really, for the children, and the latrines. Here we have just sewage running out down from a couple of latrines in between two spaces where people live. And you can see also this gives you a sense of how these living quarters are really constructed. It's just a combination of some bamboo, some light, some sticks and wood, and then also lots and lots of plastic. And here we have, by relief standards, a pretty modern, robust latrine, but put just at the edge of an area where kids and others are passing and playing. And even though these latrines are sometimes dug appropriate, they are, I think, often dug appropriately. They're put in with such close proximity that you could imagine here, when it's not the dry season, when you add 6 or 8 inches of rain in an hour to this situation, the sewage will backfill right in. And this is a picture from the camps of how tricky the terrain is. And so this was challenging for us, just up and down with our equipment, and certainly the folks who had camera gear and things like that. But imagine this setting when it starts to rain. And in fact, we did hear of mudslides, fatal mudslides, happening in the last round of rains in September, October, because many of these structures could just be washed away with just a little bit of rain.
So Homer, can you say a little bit about the health conditions in the camps and what you heard from your colleagues on the ground about the most pressing conditions and threats of disease outbreak?
Sure. We had great access to a series of health clinics that are operating inside these camps, and so we got to know many of the health staff providing primary care, OBGYN, other types of health services. And one of the things that they all referred us to is the rising tide of diphtheria and measles cases, that when they first started working in October, late September, October, there'd be a sporadic case. But when we were there 2 weeks ago, they were starting to see several, a serious uptick, so that they were seeing more and more cases every single week. The concern that they have is not only for those conditions, but as rain returns, for the really likely development of large-scale cholera, which is something that we've seen in Yemen and in other places around the world as folks are pushed together as a result of conflict.
And so we're going to move next to looking at some of the injuries that we documented, and I just wanted to note that one of the reasons for this work, and one of the reasons that PHR in particular has gone and done this work, is that our colleagues in UN agencies and other humanitarian agencies asked us and said a lot of stories are being told, and word is getting out there, and a lot of our colleagues in the human rights world are doing great work of making sure these stories are being told, but that there is not a lot of documentation happening. And so the medical documentation of these injuries and adding to the evidence base for eventual justice and accountability procedures is critical to making sure that we have on record what actually happened to people and have a medical confirmation of what these injuries mean, how they were incurred, and so it's an issue of what our niche is and the value that we're able to add to the larger work of the human rights and humanitarian community.
So thank you. I will just add a note about how important the forensic science is to accountability and telling the truth. The crux of these forensic evaluations involves doing very careful physical examination of medical records and x-rays if they happen to be available, and then contrasting and comparing that information with what someone has told us about their personal narrative, and then making a scientific assessment about how consistent one set of information is with the other. That is a medically informed scientific process. We call it forensic because it's often in service of establishing some abuse that we would be documenting. And I think that that is important because in this work, we will routinely find things that people report to us that might not be consistent through no fault of their own. So a really very quick example is a young teenager who had some what we call stria, the lines on his at the axle, the kind of right in front of the armpit, that are normal in a developing teenager as the body grows and there's a little stretching in the skin. He happened to attribute those to having been beaten and whipped, and he did actually have other marks that were consistent with being beaten and whipped, but the stria were just a normal part of him maturing as a teenager. And for us to be able to identify physical findings that are consistent with, but also those that are naturally inconsistent with the account is critical for establishing credibility, so that we don't simply take everything somebody tells us and reproduce it as the scientific version of the truth. So in that vein, we have a couple of profiles of injuries that we wanted to talk about. One is people who have been shot while fleeing or shot in the back generally, while they're walking or running away. The other is a group of very disturbing injuries that occurred when people reported being herded into houses, exposed to mass rape or sexual violence, and then having the houses set on fire while they were killed. And then there's a third set that revolve around being restrained and beaten. But we're just gonna mention two of them: the gunshot wounds and the kind of burning in homes. So both of these are important because we encountered them quite a bit. They were consistent themes in what we found, but they're also important because these cases put the lie to the narrative that this campaign of violence is one of self-defense, and it's one in response to acts of terrorism or acts of aggression. And so we think that that's critical in terms of how we think about analyzing this data. So the patient here, the survivor I'm seeing here, is a gentleman who was walking away from his village. He'd actually started to run away from his village when the soldiers had come in and started to light his house on fire, and there was general chaos, and he and others were fleeing from the village, and he was shot in the back of the leg. And so examination of his leg revealed an entry wound that was in the back of his leg. He then, we can see he was in a district hospital in Cox's Bazar, where one of the first stops for us. He had an X-ray that showed really, profound destruction of the two bones of the lower leg, the tibia, the fibula, then the tibia, and then he actually had on physical exam, the bullet had lodged kind of in the anterior space of his knee, so that you could actually feel the bullet next to the kneecap in the front of his knee. So, from a forensic standpoint, a case where the survivor gives an account of being shot from behind, there certainly is a path that can be followed all the way up to actually the bullet still being lodged in the anterior space of the front space of the knee. So to mention the other, and we saw many of the gunshot wounds that reflected this kind of injury. I've just pulled out an example of each for you. Um, this second profile of injuries I mentioned had to do with in several villages where there was a large-scale culling out of women and some small children from the rest of the village population, where there were mass shootings and killings of one group, which was largely men and boys, and then women in relatively large numbers were brought into homes subject to mass rape that was both by the military but also by individuals that the survivors identified as not being in the military. And this is really critical in terms of establishing the elements of this campaign, whether people ultimately identify it as genocide. The coordination that happened with having one group of people herding villagers into a spot, another group of people kind of culling them out, women from the rest, then mass execution of one group, pulling the women back in, and then having people already waiting in these homes to commit mass sexual violence. And so in this case, this is a typical case of what we found, a woman reported just that she had been brought back to a house that wasn't her house, but with a group of probably 20 other women and children. That once there were both soldiers and another group that weren't soldiers, civilians, that multiple of the women were sexually assaulted by multiple people, and that then all the people in the house were killed with machetes. This woman survived after having been hit in the head with a machete, being knocked out, and then she came to and experienced with a horrible smell in her nostrils and then intense pain on her feet and hands, and woke up realizing that the house had been set on fire, and she was the only survivor, and her hands and her feet and her back were severely burned, and so she was able to crawl out of the house and make her way to safety. And so the burns here, healing burns on the posterior aspect of her ankles, the back of her legs, her back, and the back of her hands kind of are consistent with the story she tells. Also are replicated in other cases we have where people have recounted the same horrible but very highly coordinated circumstance.
And we actually had one other gunshot wound case. Here we go.
Sorry.
Oh, I've gone too far.
Yes. I realized I jumped.
Sorry about that. Having an issue with a faulty keyboard. Just do 1 second while I get us back to.
Yeah, so my apologies. So we had two of the gunshot wound cases to tell you about. This second case is a brother and a sister who were together when their village was attacked. And as I mentioned in the sexual violence case, the kind of culling out of two groups, this brother and sister ended up in the group that remained at the riverside when soldiers opened fire on, according to them and the other villagers, really thousands of villagers. And they were there at the water's edge, fleeing into the water. Their parents were both killed in this attack. The girl survived, but sustained a gunshot wound to her right flank, which she ultimately was found and carried to that same district hospital that we showed the first case to be from. And you can see bullet fragments throughout her pelvis, with a large fragment there centrally at the pubic symphysis. And she struggles to walk now. She has quite a bit of pain, musculoskeletal pain from all these bullet fragments. Her wound is healed well in terms of the actual initial bullet entry wound, but she likely won't be able to walk well, for the rest of her life. Certainly, there are not physical therapy resources there, and that injury, both of those gunshot wounds, are consistent with many others we found, which had to do with being women, children. I think probably half of the injuries that we saw, without really searching out or selecting for them, were among women and children, as opposed to men. And I think that one of the fears is that the men, many of them that were in these settings, are dead. So those are the gunshot wounds. And then I mentioned a little bit about the survivor here of the household burning, in which there was sexual abuse. of the people in the house and from which she was really the only survivor.
And the one thing that I would add in just looking at how we identified these cases and the way that this work was conducted, we used a technique called snowball sampling, that once you've spoken with one survivor, you ask them, do you know other people who have experienced similar things? And the thing that really struck me and was extraordinary to me is how easy it was to find people who had suffered these injuries. These weren't isolated cases, and it took almost no work aside from wandering through the camps and asking if anyone had suffered a bullet wound or had their home burned down, and you didn't have to look far. It was truly extraordinary, the number of cases that were in front of us. And the other thing I would say is that I was struck by the courage of the survivors and their desire to tell their stories and to make sure that these stories are heard, and what I experienced as their comfort with the doctors and being able to tell these stories to a medical professional who had an expertise that allowed them to really understand the injury and the recovery process. I was genuinely struck by the survivors' desire to tell their stories and their insistence that we make sure that these stories are heard on a global level. Homer, was there a particular interaction with a survivor or story that most struck you, that either is representative or just had a particular effect on you?
I think that certainly these were all pretty striking cases. There's a couple of cases, the last two people that I evaluated, who were picked up actually before this campaign of violence started, and were men who were in a village where all the men were picked up by the military, brought to a camp, tortured. There was one murder, and then they were released. They were able to buy their way to freedom. And this all happened in the weeks before. We found, I ended up talking to these men and kind of almost by miscommunication, talking to them and realized that this has all happened before the events that we were talking about in late August. And the way they described the level of ongoing brutality that they had gotten used to, that was part of normal life in Rakhine State for the Rohingya, I think made a huge impression on me, because then it puts into context certainly how much worse this new campaign was, but also it gave me a good sense of where people are at in the camps right now, that these camps have profound public health concerns. There could be safety concerns and security concerns as time goes forward, but that the baseline everyday targeting, persecution, and outright killing that was happening for the Rohingya living in Rakhine State is just really incredible, and I did not understand what a high level of persecution they have faced for years just before this started.
And then Homer, I'll let you describe this little clip.
This is just some kids who had made a little cart that we saw, like, ingenuity all throughout the camps, and the kids and everybody else, and trying to make a normal life. We have, it's a highly traumatized group of people. They have been through unspeakable, horrors in the last few months. But like most refugee camps you would go to, there is, quite a bit of spirit that shines through, and so it's heartening to at least run across this in the midst of this work.
And can you say a little bit about the next steps for this work and what you're planning?
Sure. So we think that this documentation effort is important. We continue to hear from our partners. There has been really amazing work done by a lot of people in response to these mass crimes. And so colleagues at MSF, Doctors Without Borders, have released a very good survey of patients they saw in their clinics, trying to get an estimate of how many people died. That's really important to know. And one of the things that we found in our cases, you remember the girl that was burned who barely crawled out of the house. Well, one of the things that the traditional surveys like that done by MSF haven't been able to get at is how many whole families were wiped out in some of these settings. And so I think that for us, there are a couple of paths forward. The first is we need to do more of this kind of Istanbul protocol style documentation to flesh out, in this trip we saw.
You just say what the Istanbul
Protocol.
Protocol
The Istanbul Protocol is the kind of internationally recognized tool for evaluating survivors of torture. And so it is a tool that has been modified and used in lots of different settings. But the crux of the forensic interaction that I mentioned at the beginning, where somebody tells you their account and then you use really meticulous physical examination, a process by a physician, and then you kind of reconcile and determine the consistency of the narrative with the physical findings. The Istanbul Protocol is kind of the embodiment of that, and it's internationally supported. But we need to do more of that work because we need to do more evaluation of these cases to determine whether or not these two profiles that I mentioned, the gunshot wounds as people are kind of fleeing, and then these burns that we found quite a few of in the context of being burned in a home and sexual assault. Those profiles are striking to us, but having had 40 encounters, we have a handful of each of those. And so we need to do more of that work so that we can reliably share this forensic evidence with the international community. And I think there is an interest by several partners we have outside, academic partners outside of PHR, to dig in deeper, to get more information that isn't just the Istanbul Protocol documentation of individual survivors, but get the more total view of the scope and the level of coordination of this campaign of violence. And so we have ongoing efforts with quite a few partners about how to do that. But I anticipate that we will be back in Bangladesh in February with another team of physicians and maybe some other folks, but to kind of move in both those directions.
Thanks, Homer. We also have on the phone with us Carolyn Greco, who is our advocacy coordinator in Washington, D.C., and I wanted to ask her to speak to legislation pending on Capitol Hill and actions that could be taken legislatively that you'll hear more from us about in the coming weeks as there are opportunities to contact your legislators to take action. Carolyn, are you with us?
Thanks, DeDe. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, great. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks. Sorry about that. So thanks for that, DeDe. So there are two bills that were introduced in Congress earlier in November. They're both bipartisan, so they're supported by both Republicans and Democrats, and they're in both chambers. And there are many different pieces to the legislation, but I'll flag a few that are relevant to both our work and just documentation and accountability generally. But the bills, they authorize humanitarian assistance for the Rohingya. They specifically call on the Myanmar government to ensure that the rights of returnees are respected. So for those who are in the camp, to ensure that any return to Myanmar is safe, is voluntary, is dignified, and in accordance with international legal standards, which is very relevant to discussions of repatriation that have been going on the last few weeks. It speaks also to requiring a report. So I believe it's from an interagency report led by the State Department that would be about which individuals should be placed on visa bans. So that's going a little bit towards sanctions, and requires a report on accountability for ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and genocide in Myanmar, which speaks more to what are the avenues and mechanisms that the U.S. government can pursue alongside, international partners to ensure that the perpetrators who are responsible are held to account. So those are pieces of legislation that, again, were introduced in November, and I think our next steps going forward will be to encourage, both with our constituency, but work in partnerships with many others, to try to get as much support for the legislation within Congress, so increase the number of co-sponsorships and encourage this legislation to be voted on more quickly and get attention and pass in an effort to shape U.S. policy in Myanmar. A teeny bit of background: under the Obama administration, post the election and the rise of Aung San Suu Kyi, the Obama administration had pulled back on some of the sanctions that had been placed on Myanmar for quite some time. And so I think you hear a lot about a call within the U.S. government for bilateral sanctions to be placed, specifically targeted sanctions against senior military officials, and that language is in that bill. But there's further advocacy to be done apart from Congress, specifically with the administration, to ensure that the U.S. government really thinks very critically about imposing more sanctions given these recent events. And then, more from an international focus, in addition to bilateral sanctions between countries, to ensure that the Security Council also works to ensure that sanctions are taken, whether it's an arms embargo or multilateral sanctions to that end.
Great. Thank you so much, Carolyn. And as I said, that you'll be hearing more from Physicians for Human Rights with opportunities to communicate with your legislators about co-sponsoring and supporting that legislation when Congress is back in session in the new year. And now I wanted to ask our Director of International Policy, Susanna Sirkin, to talk about movement or lack thereof at the United Nations and efforts happening there.
Thank you, DeDe. As we have a siren going on in New York, and I wish it was being heard a few avenues up at the United Nations for the Rohingya and for the crisis in Myanmar. As we've heard, this is really probably at the moment the most extreme human rights crisis in the world, and that says a lot because we have ongoing crises in Syria and South Sudan and the DRC, but we have had in the last 6 months in Myanmar and with the refugee flows into Bangladesh, an enormous influx of refugees, more than 500,000 in a very short space of time, because there have been acts which just this week the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ziad Ra'ad Al Hussein, called possibly genocide. And that's a very significant potential finding. It's not the first time that someone has described what has happened to the Rohingya at the hands of the Myanmar military, and with the, at this point, apparent collusion, or at least according to the High Commissioner, by her acts of omission, by failing to say anything or intervene with her government, with the military, which essentially controls her government, but she's nonetheless the head of state, failing to stop these crimes, which, as far as we can see, certainly rise to the level of crimes against humanity, if not genocide. And there, in the midst of all this, the United Nations Security Council, which is charged with doing everything possible to stop these crimes and then to punish these crimes, is basically stymied. And that's to a great extent because of longstanding inertia on these types of crimes at the Security Council, but also because of the well understood likelihood that China, which has essentially been protecting Myanmar through all these years, and including overlooking the atrocities, would veto any efforts to refer these crimes by the UN Security Council to the International Criminal Court, where they definitely belong. And so in that environment, we still must continue to document, as PHR is doing, and where other colleagues in other organizations are working, because there will for sure, sooner or later, be an avenue for accountability. And that may be a different kind of tribunal, as we've seen in other countries. It may be, as Carolyn says, for the U.S., to sanction individual perpetrators, prevent them from traveling, sometimes freezing their assets. And there's certainly the importance of continuing to gather this documentation for advocacy for a much more robust an urgent humanitarian response. So our information right now helps drive that at the UN with UNICEF, with other UN agencies and individual governments, and also to continue to document so that as soon as possible, perpetrators are held accountable, and they know that they will be held accountable. And that's also important. These warning signs that we've had this very week from specific high-level officials at the UN are also, we hope, breaks on the continuation of these horrific crimes.
Thank you, Susanna. So I think we want to open it up for questions. I hope we've given you a lot to think about, and we're happy to answer any questions you might have.
I did get one coming through the chat tool, so if you would also like to chat in your question, you may. One was based on the updates that DeDe you had kindly sent while you were in Bangladesh. You had mentioned a few landmine injuries, and if you could explain more about these.
Sure. So we went to, we had a few, I talked just about the assessments of individual survivors that we did, and that was most of our work. We did, however, have a couple small areas of work. One of them was going to a hospital, a surgical hospital that had received surgical cases, much akin to the district hospital we saw where the patients were evaluated. But a purely surgical hospital had received quite a few cases. We found between 20 and 30 records of Rohingya who appeared to have sustained traumatic violence-related injuries, so not motor vehicle accidents, who had been referred to this hospital, had surgical intervention, and there, among those, there were several landmine injuries, and so these are blast injuries, shrapnel injuries that require surgical debridement, I think an amputation or two, and one of the things that really struck us about that pool of data, as we compare it to the group of people that we had personal interactions with and assessed ourselves in the camps, is that in both cases, about half of the people, the injured people, are women and children. So really a high incidence of these very serious injuries to women and children in what has been reported as a campaign of self-defense.
And the other thing that I would say about that, and we say it about so many situations, and this is a perfect example of it, that the majority of humanitarian crises in our world today began as human rights crises. And so this humanitarian crisis would not exist were it not for the decades of persecution that the Rohingya have already suffered. So that level of persecution has created the largest humanitarian crisis in the world.
And one other note about landmines, in the discussion about what happens next on the ground, there is this very problematic memorandum of understanding or agreement between two governments, between the government of Myanmar and the government of Bangladesh, that discusses how people will return, and it really omits any discussion of these mass crimes, investigation of these mass crimes, but even closer to kind of the lack of real possibility of people leaving is this notion that people ran through minefields to get where they are today. They sustained these injuries, women and children. And so the notion that there is a safe path for them, I think, is pretty much put to rest by the types of injuries we encounter, but also the fact that they would have to go back through the same path.
And for us, there are two huge and tragic ironies in that fact, and one is that this is the 20th anniversary of the signing of the International Landmine Treaty, for which PHR shared the Nobel Peace Prize, and so that those weapons continue to be used, and that the United States and Myanmar are among the handful of countries that have never signed that ban is a national shame for the United States and contributes to the ongoing crisis for the Rohingya.
I had a question about I'm curious if, through your work there, if you interacted with any specific news organizations or journalists who you think are doing particularly good work.
Yeah, absolutely. And so actually we had a fixer and a photographer who both had done work for journalists as well, and they said, and I agree based on my analysis of the news cycle, that Reuters is really doing some of the best work coming out of the region. I highly recommend their interactive graphics, which really, and we can send those around after the call. But there are some really remarkable tools that they put out helping to graphically illustrate and help you understand what is happening there. They've done some of, I think, the most sensitive and insightful analysis of some of the storytelling. And the AP just sort of followed on. Reuters was really leading, I mean, it's not a competition, but Reuters was really leading the pack for a while, and the AP, I think on the last day we were there, so it's been now a little over a week, just put out their big, a new big piece on it. But I think they're the two really that I would say it's really worth following their journalists. We did have a chance to speak with a CBS journalist who is working on a story that will come out in January, February. There are never any guarantees, so I can't guarantee you that PHR will be featured in the piece, but CBS is working on a large interactive online piece that they'll put out. It sounded like in early February, and they shot footage of Dr. Har in the field and interviewed her to talk about her findings as well.
And we should just mention that in terms of journalism, I mean, one of the most chilling aspects of this crisis is that the Myanmar government has essentially completely blocked access to Rakhine State, and so journalists are not able and have not been able for many months to go into the area where these crimes have been committed. And that's why, we don't have a lot of any information except from the survivors from the ground.
And we did, through our talking to people, and we're not the first to find this, but several of the survivors we evaluated reported mass graves that were, as people were being killed or after people were being killed, mass graves being dug or coming across a newly dug mass grave. Those are all, nobody has access to those. And so you have hundreds, if not thousands, of bodies that are sitting in mass graves. And it's not just that there's no truth-telling because the government won't allow independent access to investigate. It's also that, the ultimate, a really strong component of justice in these mass grave situations is for families to be able to reclaim the remains of their loved ones. And so our work in Afghanistan and lots of countries around the world has been towards this ultimate goal, not simply of telling the truth of what happened, but of reconnecting families with the remains of their loved ones. And all of that right now is impossible because of this baseline lack of access and that the military has taken.
And we were in touch with some journalists who were working on a mass grave story, and while we were there and while that was happening, those two journalists went missing in Rakhine State. And so there's been a fair amount of media coverage. They were Reuters journalists who had gained access to Rakhine State, which is not permitted, and have since gone missing. And so Reuters is continuing to raise the issue with the Myanmar government, but they have not yet been found.
And I do have one question that came in while you were discussing the landmines, and that was when you're speaking of surgeries, what the condition of that clinics or hospitals were in these situations.
Yeah, the places we saw the most frequently or the most consistently were the clinics that are in the camps. And so those they're very makeshift, so they don't have running water, which is really critical. They don't have electricity. They do have a few of them, either a generator or propane-driven appliances, but those medical clinics, for most people, most of the care is happening in those settings. So they're not, then there are a small number of field hospitals, but the only really field hospital that is able to perform surgeries that's in the camps or near the camps is the Red Cross facility. And then MSF has some facilities that can do some limited surgeries. But as I mentioned, the hospital where we reviewed the records is in the opposite direction of Cox's Bazar. It's up north. And there, MSF and others had referred patients either up there or into the Cox's Bazar district hospital itself. So the first wave of patients coming in, survivors coming in, had lots of orthopedic injuries, required surgeries. Right now, the need is for ongoing medical OBGYN care. There's virtually no psychosocial support or psychiatric care available, and that's really a profound and compounding need. And then the thing that could quickly overwhelm the resources that exist is with a wider communicable disease outbreak, such as cholera, in which case really the delivery of oral rehydration, just basic medical care will be the need will quickly eclipse the resources.
Any other questions from the phone? So if there are no further questions, I think we can wrap for the day. I really want to thank everyone for your interest in this subject and for your support of Physicians for Human Rights. We will keep you updated on the ongoing work, and as I promised, you'll have the opportunity for action and contacting your legislators, and we'll be happy to follow up with additional resources from the media, and then when we put out our report next year as well. But again, on behalf of Dr. Homer Venters and myself and all of Physicians for Human Rights, thank you very much for being with us today.